Welcome to the third episode of Shortcast Over Coffee. This episode is a continuation of episode 2, my conversation with Krish Ashok. In this episode, we talk about food, modern medicine versus homeopathy, and veganism. Hope you enjoy.
Yeah. And I think this not having documentation also applies to food.
We know what Sumerians ate for breakfast 5,000 years ago. Okay, we have a single digit number of cookbooks in the last 3,000 years in all of India for a part of the
Manasalola.
world that has some of the greatest food in the world. We have absolutely nothing.
Yeah, I mean, while researching for this podcast, I was looking up cookbooks written in
That's it.
India,
It'll all
and
go back to the same Manasola South. Yes.
I could find that, and I could find Samaitapar and Mishtanapak in Bengali and so on.
Samay Tapar is basically just less than a century ago,
Oh, okay.
right? I mean, that was Meenakshi Amma, right? Yeah.
Right. So when did you start developing interest in food? When did you start cooking? Was it when you started
I mean,
cooking, or you had it? Yeah.
well, in the sense that most guys develop an interest in eating and food when they're teenagers, I suppose, right? That's when you suddenly get
Huge
hungry for
appetites.
everything. Yeah, huge appetites and so on. But then I it was also about the time when I started to learn to cook. My mother had a transferable job, and I was the eldest son, so she taught me how to cook, right? And then when I went to the US, I ended up learning from a few other older people in the family. I wrote down recipes and so on. That was sort of like the inception of my thought process that there's something wrong with trying to document this kind of knowledge as recipes, because it misses the fact that many of these good cooks don't think in recipes. They think in heuristics and algorithms and meta models. And for them, rasam is not one recipe. It's a whatever ingredients I have, I can turn it into a sambar or rasam or whatever it is. I have a broad set of algorithms, and that was sort of like the inception for Masala Lab, if you will.
Okay. And we in our family, and I know most families in South India talk about this thing called Satwik food. Is there
Hmm.
any merit to Satwik food, or is it just glorified?
No, it's sort of like it's basically a way of creating a caste system with food and saying that this is superior food, and all you other peasants are eating inferior food, and it gives you bad qualities and so on, right? I mean, you look at the definition of Sattvic food. Not particularly very tasty food, right? I mean, no onion, no garlic, and there's no enjoyment in life. It's fine. I mean, you make the choice, you do it, but I think the definition is almost the definition of Sattvic food does not make sense unless there is a tamasic food, right? There has to be a bad for you to then declare it good, right? And so there's actually no basis. There is actually no scientific basis to it being any better or any such thing. It's largely just a cultural marker of the sort of general tendency over the last 2,000 years to look down on meat eating, look down on eating practices of people who are not from the upper caste of the Hindu society, right? So that's essentially. So people get very upset when I tell them that, well, it's casteist, but I'm not calling you casteist. It's just that I don't buy into the Sattvic food because it's built on this edifice of caste. I'm okay with you not seeing caste in it and using it to eat healthy. Right, a Sattvic lifestyle can genuinely help you stay healthy. It's a lot of fresh vegetables. I mean, you're not eating too much saturated fat. I think it's great, etc. Yes, you can deprive yourself of a lot of good food and so on, but that's fine. I mean, it helps you. It helps you, right? So in that sense, yes. So, but then if you're using it as a moral cudgel to look down on what others eat, I think that's quite silly. And I think there's also been a modern tendency to try and apply it in random new modern contexts that originally anyway nobody had a clue about, right? They'll say Sattvic food cannot be cooked in a microwave, cannot, like, whoever wrote about those things 2,000 years ago didn't know what microwave is or what a refrigerator was, right? But yeah, so there's always this retroactive way of applying those older ideas in modern context, and that's sometimes hilarious, right? It rarely doesn't fit, and people have to cherry pick, right? So people will say Ayurvedic method and so on, right? How many people know that a megaton of Ayurvedic remedies for so many diseases is deer meat? Deer meat is the most holy meat in food in Hindu culture. It was Sita's favorite food. The number of times deers are hunted and fed, and she makes basically deer biryani, right? So it's called mamsodhana, right? And in Sanskrit, in the Ramayana, is like insane number of times, right? And every few times she has a dialogue, she's like praising the brilliance of venison meat and so on. And why do you think Maricha was a deer, right? You think she wanted to keep a pet? No, she wanted to eat that damn thing, right? So I think people forget those kinds of things and they very cherry pick. So alcohol and venison were the most common Ayurvedic medicines. People now want to say no, it's only about the herbs, right? Because now apparently it's inconvenient if you suddenly want to slaughter some deer and eat its heart to cure some disease, right? And likewise, I think garlic was also a huge part of Ayurvedic cures, right? The funny thing, just Google for the Bower manuscript, okay? Bower. This guy found it in somewhere in Afghanistan or somewhere in that part of the world. One of the oldest Sanskrit texts we know in Devanagari ever, okay? And what is it about? It's a love poem to garlic, saying that this is the most amazing thing on the planet, that it can cure everything, right? It's a complete treatise on garlic, right? And now you think about garlic being tamasic and all of that. So it's actually quite funny, right? So I think there is, I think you can appreciate and celebrate and be interested in your history. But I think, if you want to suddenly take that and try to force fit it into the modern world, it's going to be funny.
Yeah. Interesting you mentioned Ayurveda and tradition and all that. I know in Bengal there is this thing called Koi Machir Ganga Jamna, where they purposely sort of mishmash flavors. Like one fish is fried with mustard sauce and the other with chili, I think.
Yes.
And in Ayurveda, we have this thing where you're not supposed to mix foods or mix contrasting flavors. I find it very ironic because sometimes the contrast is what gives the taste, right?
Exactly. Yep.
So what do you have to take?
Again, as I said, so again, it's a classic thing of so I think we are taking modern day Ayurvedic practitioners' interpretation of what they meant 2000 years ago, and their word for it, that no, you must not mix, right, under any conditions, right? So first we have to establish that. So in a way, I think what happens is that in any of these discourses, the moment you say no, they were wrong 2000 years ago, I think that you lose people that way. Nobody wants to hear that the sort of the holistic wellness system that underpins the Indian diet and nutrition culture for the last 2000 years was wrong. Of course it was not. I mean, it was a product of its times and it made sense then. And by the way, people never wrote things down and things changed over time. So I've often found it easier to basically say, to question whether some of these people, whether what you're saying is even Ayurveda at all, right? Or at the very least, it is your interpretation, okay? And you can say, yes, I'm referring to that text. And by the way, who reads Sanskrit? Who understands all of that? You're probably reading an English translation. Who says the English translation was correct? That Sanskrit is notoriously hard to translate, and so many things have been mistranslated. The words can have multiple meanings, and you're taking it out of context. We have no way of knowing whether that particular phrase and that word meant the same thing 2000 years ago. You have no way of knowing. So therefore, the first thing to establish is this sort of establish the fact that you, in this modern day, saying Ayurveda according to Ayurveda, you are speaking in the modern context. You have nothing to do with the past as much as I do. Okay. So you are claiming it, but I would deeply question that. So now if you really step back and think about it, look, there were different times. There was no electricity. There was no there was no sort of pasteurization of milk and so on. We also didn't have the knowledge of things like microbes and so on. So a lot of that knowledge was practical knowledge based on the fact that if you kept fish out for a while and then you ate it, you're going to get sick. If you keep milk out for half an hour, 1 hour, it's going to go bad, right? And so people evolved a lot of careful practices to make sure that people were not food poisoned. Right? Now the problem is that over 2000 years can be misinterpreted, distorted, amplified. Some things can be selectively chosen, some things can be muted. Look, 1960s or something, or 70s, when Elvis Presley died, there was a funeral, it was on TV, and there is a burial, there's a gravestone, and there's still billions of people in the US who believe Elvis didn't die, right? We just, if we can't fix this in 50 years or say 60 years, how much distortion do you think is going to happen like 2000 years, right? I think people sometimes forget that. So in that sense, I think you have to look at it in that context. It might have made, those rules may have made sense in that context, in that part of India. It may not have been Bengal. How do you know, right? So it's possible that nobody in Bengal 2000 years had a problem with mixing fish either. How do you know? You have no way of knowing, right? So now suddenly people are saying, no, it is universal. I'm going to apply whatever that one rule for everyone. North and South don't even agree on what is hot and cold foods, because every region is different, and there is nothing wrong about that. It is just that the region is different, the weather is different, the foods are different. For starters, nobody in North India would have even tasted some of the vegetables that grow only in South India. Only now we have markets where you can get everything everywhere. Even right now, it's not easy to find a raw banana in a Delhi sabji mandi, right? Right. So the point is that I think you have to look at it that way. And so therefore, first disconnect that connection to the past that people claim, and then let's talk as what makes sense today, right? If you eat it, am I becoming sick? Are millions of people who are eating that combination, have they fallen sick in the last 50 years? That's a long enough time for you to have clinical data. And if that's not the case, just go about doing what you want. So I think that's the way to think about it, right? So I don't want to give people who claim to be Ayurvedic people the exclusive right to claim ownership over that history. I want to challenge them and say, I don't think you know. I'm not saying I know. Let's both say that we have no clue. That is the first honest thing to do. And then we can speak as people who are contemporary, not with you are creating this artificial tether to the past based on mistranslations and distortions and lost knowledge and oral transmission and English translations and so on. Hey, like the Panchatantra getting translated from Sanskrit to Persian to Arabic to Persian and then back to Sanskrit. I mean, come on, how many change stories do you think would have changed, right?
Yeah. I think one of the other things that families in India have is this thing called, I don't know, this is a very Malayalam term. It's called Automoli. So what Automoli is, for people who can't understand, is that it's a single fix medicine. Like, it's one medicine that can cure everything. So for instance, if I fall sick with common cold or fever, my mom would just give me chukku kapi or like rasam.
Yes.
What does it actually do? Does it actually cure fever or inflammation, or what does it actually do?
No, I think so. The first thing people sort of don't realize about how medicine works, and again, and I'm saying this as purely someone who's sort of studied biology in high school and did a medical entrance. I'm not a doctor in any sense, right? But I had a good enough biology teacher to sort of understand this, and I speak to doctors when I create my content for Instagram and so on. Is that I think the fundamental error that people often make is the causal agent error, meaning that we are all wired to think that there are simple, straightforward, single causal agents for things, right? You didn't get married, Mars is in the wrong place in your horoscope. That's obviously an extreme sort of nonsensical example, but I think if people do that, right? You're unwell, you eat ginger, you get well. So ginger must have done the trick, is the correlation that has come from years and years and years, and it's orally transmitted knowledge, right? The problem is that people don't realize that if you did not have that ginger, and let's say you are not from South India or you're from some part of the world where ginger is not a thing, right? Maybe in that part of the world, it was some other thing, some flower, local flower, buttercup or something that you had to eat. And again, you got well, and that culture will say, yes, it's buttercup that actually did the trick. The reality is that there might have been some part of the world where the guy ate absolutely nothing and still got well, right? Because the nature of illness is that your body tries to fix itself. Okay, that's just how we are built, right? The bulk of curing you is not medicine, even in modern medicine, unless it's a very specific surgical intervention that prevents you from dying and all of that. Your body cures itself of all chronic conditions. We are designed as a self-repair mechanism, right? The goal is to make sure that you're giving it the right inputs and not stressing it so that you're not stopping it from curing itself. That's all you're doing. So what happens is that when you fall sick, automatically people stop giving you fried food. They give you simple, easy to digest food. They cut down the oil, they cut down frying, they cut down a bunch of these other things that could be allergens and irritants and all these kind of things. And they give you stuff, simple carbs that are easy to eat with micronutrients and so on. So your body, your immune system is focused on the job at hand of curing your problem, right? Uh, and then things you even when you take a thing like a paracetamol is not actually curing your disease. All it's doing is lowering your temperature, and it is a painkiller. It's an analgesic, right, from an inflammation. Why is there inflammation? The inflammation is there to cure your problem, actual problem. That's what your immune system is doing, right? And it's just that I think people. So ginger particularly is interesting because you'll have ginger for a bad throat, pepper and ginger for a bad throat, because pepper and ginger are actually throat irritants. So because they have molecules that irritate the nerves in the throat, right? But they are temporary irritants. So but what happens is that when they irritate your throat, your brain now has to divide its attention between your actual throat problem and the pepper and ginger irritation problem. So temporarily you feel relief because it's dealing with another problem, right? And hopefully your body is figuring out a cure for that while that's happening. So you keep swinging ginger and you're counter irritating, and your brain is dividing its attention while parallelly your body is fixing that problem. And over time you're like, oh man, yeah, that felt good, and so it's the ginger that did the trick, right? And this is, by the way, this is also why quack medicine systems like homeopathy still survive, because most day-to-day conditions just fix themselves. Sometimes just people lead unhealthy lives, and so it takes a little bit longer. If people may be diabetic, it might take a little longer. They have pure immunity, it might take a little bit longer. Lifestyle stresses and so on. And it's just that people think, no, it's that medicine. That medicine is literally nothing. It's just a sugar tablet. That's it. The principle of homeopathy is to dilute things down to absolute nothingness. It is like violation of the fundamental laws of chemistry, right? But yet people vehemently believe it made a difference because they're not giving their own body the credit. That's what this is.
Right. Yeah, I mean, to people I talk to about homeopathy, they are like, it works. What about that? I mean, they don't really
Yeah.
think about why it
Yeah.
worked or
It
why it
works.
did not work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Correct. So because that is why, this is precisely why in modern medicine or evidence-based medicine, a drug has to pass that test. That's what a double-blind trial is, right? A
Yeah.
double-blind trial essentially has to address for all of these biases. One, it has to answer the question, uh, does it show improvement, right? By the way, it has to show improvement compared to a population who has not been given that drug, but with the same condition. It has to show a relative improvement over the part of the population that was given the placebo. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that it also has to prove that any other condition, any other variable that you may have that could have fixed the problem, that has to be controlled for, right? So when you do that test, people cannot take, like, say, 4 drugs at a time. They cannot, like, say, take a very special diet, etc., etc. No. It all has to be controlled for. Otherwise, the drug test is not passed, right? The problem is that if you just do a double blind test for ginger and pepper and turmeric and all these other things, they will fail these double blind tests. Again, it's possible some of them will pass, but the problem is that the establishment does not want to do that, because that would result in a revenue loss of so many thousands of crores, right? That's the problem.
Yeah, I think it's high time, just like how you mentioned about music, the boundaries between genres are sort of going
Yeah.
away. It should be the same with medicine as well. Like, there should not be any Ayurveda or allopathy. It should just be
No,
modern
it should
medicine or
it should be
evidence-based.
it should be evidence-based medicine, right? And there's a good chance if everyone goes through the double blind test, who knows how many amazing uh, herbal medicines we might uncover from tribal communities and local communities that have tremendous ecological local knowledge, uh, and so on. Let's remember that we extract most of the compounds that we use in our drugs from plants. Like, it's not like we make them in a lab. They're too complicated. We extract them from plants, right? And so for example, the recent Chinese willow thing used in traditional Chinese medicine, the people finally agreed to do a double-blind test, and it turned out to be tremendously successful for malaria, right? And so now it's going to become a evidence-based drug for malaria as well, and it originated in traditional Chinese medicine. And yet we don't have a single example of a modern medicine that originated in an Ayurvedic cure, which is silly. All you have to do is do those double-blind tests.
Right. Yeah, and I think in India, I don't know about other states, but Kerala might be the only state where the government opens homeopathy medical colleges.
No, there is a Ministry of Ayush. They're doing it everywhere.
Oh, okay. Very interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I know. I mean, for a state with that much education, I think the belief in these other medical systems, alternative medicine, is actually scarily high. And again, it's a weird thing, right? So they have this allopathy pharmacy and Siddha pharmacy, right? The term allopathy actually refers to a very quack-based medical system before evidence-based medicine came. If no doctor today should agree to be being called an allopathic doctor, it's complete nonsense. Yeah. Anyway.
Right. Yeah. Now moving on to food again. I have this small anecdote that I have to tell you of how I got interested in trail of food and how food sort of transcended boundaries. I think it was 2014 or 2015. I was on a solo trip to New York, and the A train, the subway broke down, and then I got down at this station called Nostrand Avenue, and I'm a vegetarian, so I got out and I was looking for vegetarian food in the area, and there was this place called A&A Double and Roti Shop. I was not sure what it was, and then I just went in. It was not an Indian store, but it had roti in its name, so I was
Yeah.
like, why not? And I got this thing called doubles, okay,
Yeah.
and I tried it, and
Caribbean, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, it was
Yeah.
great, and it was
Yes.
oddly enough, it was reminding me of chole bhature. And
Yeah.
I asked the person, where he's from, and then what is this dish, and he said that this is roti, and we put chana masala inside. And I asked him where are you from, and he said Trinidad.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's fascinating how Indian food or Indian curry, as
Yes.
Britishers like to call it, made its way
Yes.
all the way to Trinidad. And
Yeah.
obviously, having followed cricket, I know, there were a lot of Indian slaves who went to Trinidad. But talking about curry itself, how did the word curry become so popular? Like, what are sort of the first sort of traces of Indian curry going abroad?
No, I think the word itself originally goes back to old Tamil, right? I mean, curry usually refers to a meat gravy. A spicy meat gravy is what curry is, right? So Tamil Nadu, you can still hear it in the village side. So curry saapudringla means that like it's usually a chicken, mutton, or a beef thing, right? And over time, I think the Portuguese who kind of then first started taking back these spices and so on, because most of those spices kind of came from the south, right? They came from Kerala and Tamil Nadu and so on. So they started to apply those same things when those spices were used in European cooking. So they caril or something, Caril, and then that eventually in Europe kind of became curry. So any kind of dish that came from this part of the world became a curry. And then the British over, post-industrial revolution really embraced this as Bangladeshi sort of Silheti sailors starting opening these curry houses, if you will, right, in England. And again, basically, originally it was too spicy for them, but then it became a thing amongst the 20th, 21st century for young football fans to watch football fans and then come back after their team has won or lost or whatever it is, fully drunk and eat. And the thing about alcohol is that it actually mutes your taste buds. So after that, Indian food is perfect, even if you're like super spice sensitive, because it hits the right spot when you're like when you're fully drunk, right? The Japanese curry again is of not directly of Indian origin, but actually of British origin, right? So they introduced the curry powder. And then clearly the British sent Indian indentured sort of indentured slaves to all over the world, right? I mean, So they found it convenient to take a moral high ground when the Industrial Revolution happened, to be against slavery. Till that point, they were pro-slavery. So once actual horsepower and engines uh, looked like a better idea than actual human power, they're like, oh, no, 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 now slavery is bad. So, but obviously they recognize that machines can't fix everything, and you still, sugarcane is still notoriously, labor intensive, and cotton is still notoriously labor intensive. So they obviously, I think they found exploited Dalits and lower caste communities in India, and they just sent them all over, right? And that's the origin of people in Suriname, in Guyana, in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, particularly, right? In Malaysia, in Sri Lanka, right? And
Fiji,
so many
yeah,
places. Fiji, yeah, you name it, yes.
yeah,
Mauritius, Reunion, yeah.
yeah. Is there any difference between the ingredients that goes into a Japanese curry from British?
So it's basically, no, it's just a curry powder that they use, and then the rest of the preparation is very Japanese. It's Japanese rice, and then a lot of vegetables and meat, and everything else, and it's also like super spicy. So you can customize the spice, and they also add flour, maida, into that, so that it has that sort of like a thick glaze like texture, which they like, and so that's what goes into the Japanese curry. Yes.
Okay. So what are the subtle differences between whole spices? I mean, things that go into a curry. Um, Different recipes talk about, first roasting the spices and then blending, powdering them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
some of the other recipes talk about just add coriander powder. So what is
Yeah.
the like when should one use whole spices versus powdered spices?
Really, no such. The thing is that I think people overthink these things. So the broad principle are that the whole spice is going to have the maximum flavor, uh, but if you roast it, it's going to have even more flavor. Right? It's going to release a lot more of the aromatics that are trapped inside, and so on. Right? And so whole spices, you want to either heat them in oil or dry roast them. Right? Either
Okay.
way, or you do both. Right? But if you're making a powder out of the whole spices, then dry roast them. Right? So you get the more intense flavor, if you will. And again, it varies. Sometimes you don't want that intense flavor. You can just go straight, right? Cumin is a big difference. Cumin with dhania actually doesn't make much of a difference, but cumin, roasted cumin powder and just cumin powder, very different things. Because the people like to roast it really brown, uh, partially black almost, and then use that powder, at least in chaat and all that. They use like really, really bhuna jeera powder and so on. So there's just different flavors. And I think different regions and different dishes, the person with that recipe might say, this is what I want and this is what I want you to do. It's really just completely arbitrary, right? So it doesn't really, uh, it's just that every spice comes with its unique flavor profile, and you combine them. Like if you're a Maharashtrian or a Bengali cuisine, they tend to combine spices that are contrasting in flavors. In Mughlai, Awadhi cooking, they tend to combine spices that are more sort of work together with similar flavor molecules. And so these are just sort of, flavor is higher in Bengali and Maharashtrian food, a lot smaller in, say, Mughlai or Awadhi food. And so on, right? So these are just, so as I said, there are no universal rules. So if you're using a powder, remember that if you're adding it to a gravy, you're going to lose most of that aroma to the air by the time the cooking is done, right? And you're not actually going to have it inside the dish, because many of these flavors are fat soluble and not water soluble, right? Unless your dish has a lot of oil, a lot of that aroma is going to go away, right? So which is why we add garam masala right at the end, so you don't actually lose some of those, because those are the more expensive spices, and so you add it at the end, the really, really aromatic stuff, right? Kasuri methi and garam masala and so on, right? So that's it. And if you do really, really want to lock in the flavor, you add it to the oil. You add the whole spice to the oil, because if you add the powdered spice, it will burn. So that's why you add the whole spices. That's really all there is to it. The combinations themselves are regional, and purely every chef defines a different mix that they like.
Right. And I was looking at some of your cooking videos on YouTube, and I noticed one particular thing that I don't see in other cooking videos is that you use alcohol in Indian cooking.
Yes.
What is the secret behind using alcohol?
It's not like alcohol has never been used in Indian cooking. Let's just, alcohol has probably not been used in upper caste Indian cooking. Let's just say that, right? it is very, very common in tribal communities. In rural Andhra, toddy chicken is a thing. I mean, kaldu is was used to make appam in Kerala. Come on, right? I mean, till yeast and baking powder became a thing, you got the yeast from the kaldu, right? And kaldu chicken or toddy chicken and toddy mutton and all of that was a big thing in South India in general, right? So it's not like we were not using it. It's just that the puritanical nature of the British working with the upper caste essentially made many of these diverse practices less known. Right? That's all. Right. So in that sense, I think alcohol serves like it's a fantastic solvent, and it really gets a lot more flavor out of spices. And by the time the cooking is done, the actual alcohol is actually evaporated. So it's not like you're actually eventually adding alcohol.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I know is that Portuguese, when they came to India, they did not have vinegar, and they used toddy vinegar, or some
Yeah.
sort of an alcohol from toddy to marinate their chicken or
Yeah.
something.
Yes. So fenny, and the they would make the wine from cashew apple or coconut and so on. The fenny, and right, and that would be used, and that is still used in Goa actually. Yeah.
Oh,
Right,
okay.
and eventually, I think eventually once they started bringing their own wine, and the wine would obviously become oxidized here, and it would turn into vinegar, right? So vinegar is basically sour wine, right? It's fermented wine,
Right.
right? It's a different bacteria, and that once that bacteria gets in, there is no rescuing wine, and wine will become vinegar. Right? So
Hmm.
vinegar originates in wine. Yeah,
Okay. So what do you think is the most overrated dish in India?
I think it's hard to. So these are all, like, for example, I think most of the, I would think what generally serves as the definition of Indian food in the West, right? Purely as a historical accident of the first generation of people going there and setting up restaurants, just happened to be like Punjabis, if you will. Uh, and I hesitate to call it Punjabi food because it's not like your traditional home cooked Punjabi food. It's a restaurant generic North Indian Punjabi category of food, um, which I personally think is uh, the fact that everyone around the world thinks that that's what Indian food is the sort of thing that I would say makes it a bit overrated. Meaning that it's
Overrated.
because even in India, you go to any restaurant, you get that those dishes, right? The butter chicken, paneer tikka masala, butter naan category of dishes in a country with so much culinary variation and so on. It's in general, I think the small minority of dishes that happen to be restaurant friendly. A restaurant friendly dish is basically things that can be prepared ahead of time, can be rapidly put together, easy to train a inexperienced cook, is what that is, right? So that's why you won't get, like, say, a parpusli or say Maharashtrian stuffed bindi is not something you will get in a restaurant because it's very laborious and takes time. Only your grandmother will make it, right? So in general, I think everything that serves as the small number of dishes that serve as restaurant friendly dishes, those end up being the overrated dishes for the most part.
Right. And I also get this feeling that a lot of recipes or spices, just because they were not the most mass produce friendly, probably would have even died down, right? I mean, maybe some of the
Yeah,
recipes from the 40s and the 50s, because they were
yeah,
so labor
absolutely.
intensive, they are
Yeah,
probably not
yeah,
made
absolutely.
in, yeah.
And not written down. And then as people started living in nuclear families, yeah, absolutely, absolutely, right.
Right, right. And so I live in the US, and US grad students, especially in universities that are not in major cities, find really difficult to get Indian vegetables and curry leaves and so on. So
What's an
when you,
Indian vegetable?
I mean, I'm talking about like curry leaves or bitter. Yeah,
80% of what 80% of the vegetables eaten in India were introduced in the last 100 years.
right. Okay.
So carrot and cabbage and cauliflower and so barring the gourds and a few roots, right? I mean, even the famous Kerala tapioca is, originally from Brazil, came to Africa, then from Africa came to this during the reign of one of the Travancore Maharajas when they had a rice shortage, and it was introduced as a crop on the advice of the British East India Company resident. As a way to get the poorest of the poor to not die from starvation, right? So that they could just grow the kappa around their houses and then catch the fish from the backwaters, and that's what became kappa mean, right? So basically, I think or kappa beef for that matter, right? So I think it is a so yeah. So in that sense, I think, and the other point again, as I say about the pav bhaji, right? I mean, you can make Indian food out of anything. So you can actually go get any vegetable you want. You can go to any supermarket. There'll be a spices section, and I'm absolutely certain you can get the whole spices that you need to make an Indian spice mix. Sure, curry leaf is a particularly sore point for South Indians because it's an irreplaceable aroma and flavor that you will simply not get with any other ingredient. But typically, North Indian food you can make with ingredients you find in Walmart.
Right.
That's been my experience. So
Right.
you can buy pepper, you can buy cumin, you can buy many of these other spices, and then you grind them and make your own garam masala, and you're done.
Yeah.
Because Mexican cuisine is big on cumin, right? It's big on coriander. You can get all of them.
Right. Yeah. Growing up in a South Indian household, I did not understand the value of curry leaves till I came to the
Yes.
US because
Yeah,
it
absolutely.
makes a
Yes.
massive difference. I mean, a
Yes.
dish
Yeah.
without curry
If you're in the
leaves,
south, if you're in the south, you can grow it, but yeah, not otherwise. Yeah.
not otherwise.
So
Yeah.
I know that all the Indians living in Florida absolutely grow their own curry leaves. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. They have like coconut palms and whatnot in their
Yeah.
backyard,
Yeah.
especially
Yes.
south of
Yes.
Florida.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's great to see how well Masala Lab is doing. I find it in libraries in the US,
Yeah. Yes.
San Jose,
Yeah.
Sunnyvale, and it's very very popular. So kudos
So
to
there's
that.
actually a North America a hardcover edition coming out later this year.
Oh,
So with more professional illustrations and more tables and more graphics and hardbound more higher quality, not exactly coffee table, but still a more premium version of the book
oh,
for North
fantastic.
America. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have plans for another book?
Been thinking about it. At least my publisher has been nudging me towards it, but not really put pen to paper yet.
Okay, okay, awesome. But Masala Lab is doing great. I'm following your Instagram channel. That's doing pretty well as well. But I would like to end the show on a slightly controversial note. I told some of my friends that I'm going to interview you as my next guest, and she pointed me to one of your posts from April 26th this year. It
Oh,
was about veganism and meat eating and all of that, and then and then
yeah,
it's fascinating. You got quite a few responses for that post, and then
yeah. Oh, but I don't read comments. So in general,
yeah.
yeah. So
uh,
other people think that, oh my God, so many comments. I said, no, I don't actually. I might engage with comments for the first 10 or 15 minutes and then I stop. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you got quite a few comments. I think this is probably your
Yes.
most engaged post. You
Yeah.
end the post by saying reducing the complexity of food systems to shallow social media virtue signaling helps no one. We all need
Yeah.
to try and do better to make food systems sustainable and ethical.
Yes.
So my question is that what do you think about the rise of veganism and veganism being tied to sustainability and this whole holier than thou narrative that
Yeah.
veganists sometimes bring in.
I think the vast majority of vegans are actually great and lovely people who are actually doing good for the planet. I think any individual who's generally consuming less meat and less dairy is doing well for the planet. I think there is just no doubt about it. There is just no this thing about it at all. I purely have a problem with people who judge others' choices for it, because I think that the problem is that it's that tiny percentage of those vegan activists who and there are again two categories of activists. I have some good friends who are vegans whose activism is, let me create content that makes life easier for vegans. Some fantastic recipes, how to replicate this taste exactly in a vegan sense. And so I said that's fantastic, because you're actually going to encourage someone who may not be vegan to try it out one day, and every day someone who's not eating meat and so on is doing the planet a world of good, right? So in that sense, I think there's that kind of activism. I find the second category of just social media warriors, keyboard warriors, just going to random people's comments and then saying that, but how do you feel, killing a chicken and eating it and all of that. That I think is just completely, utterly stupid and ignorant, right? And the reason for that is that people just don't understand the reality of the world, right? And I want to sort of put some very interesting statistics. A lot of that category of activism comes from a very Western idea of what veganism is and what it's fighting against, which is what I find hilarious. The food world of India is very different. Americans consume 10 times more animal protein than Indians do. The most carnivorous Indian is consuming 10 times less protein than the average American. Okay. The typical American meal is so protein heavy is that the steak or the other is the centerpiece, and then you have other things on the other side. In India, the centerpiece is rice or wheat. Then you have like your entire chicken curry will have like some 2 pieces. It's like a great day when somebody gets like a one full leg piece. It's like a celebratory moment, right? I mean, a fish curry will have like 2 pieces of fish in what is essentially a large amount of gravy, right?
And it was usually
So
a
first,
weekend affair,
yeah, and it's also a very special day affair. The people are not like eating it like 3 times a day and so on. So that's number one. So the per capita consumption here is significantly small. So the average Indian is effectively vegan. And you are then going and shouting at someone for enjoying a biryani, using cruelty and all that nonsense, using information and data that you've learned from the West and all the activists you follow from the West, right? In the US, 25% of their greenhouse gases are from beef cattle, right? What do you think the numbers are in India? People have no clue. And you don't have to trust me. Just go look up the actual government data, right? 74% of all greenhouse gases in India come from vehicles and energy production, your electricity, coal and natural gas, running factories, lighting homes and cars and trucks. That's 74%. 14% is food. Only 14%. In that, half is dairy cattle. So I particularly find it hilarious when vegetarians are like, you guys are screwing the planet by eating meat. I said, boss, the biggest contributor of greenhouse gases in food in India is milk. And do you know why? Because milk only comes from half of the cattle population, because only the females. So what do you do with the males? You export them. India is the world's largest exporter of beef because we have 1/3 of the world's cattle. Because if you kept them around here, your greenhouse gases are going to go through the roof, right? So you're exporting them as beef, right? So therefore, that's number one, right? The second largest contributor of greenhouse gases is rice. Everybody thinks, you look at a paddy field, the thing that comes to your mind is not a greenhouse gas emitter. Oh, it's a plant. It's green. It's beautiful. Of course, it must be capturing carbon. You bet not, because rice plantations, they're forever standing in water. There is a specific kind of bacteria that is there in that water that ends up leaking carbon. So a paddy field, a few acres of paddy field, about as bad as a factory. How many people realize this? When you look at a factory, you know it's polluting, it's greenhouse gas. You look at a paddy field, you think it's amazing. No, it is a net carbon positive, carbon negative, right? So and India grows so much rice, right? And on top of that, your Punjab farmers will burn all of the stubble and then generate more carbon as well, right? So therefore, in that entire this thing, I saw that chart. Poultry and poultry, which is the third contributor, does not even show up on that chart, because that is how little meat Indians actually eat, right? So which is why I really just, because the problem is that I would just, in so many videos, I would essentially keep saying people should eat more plants, right? As much as possible. It's good for the planet. It's also good for your health and so on, right? And you'll say that. And then one post about egg, and then there'll be like some bunch of actives will land up. And I said, you guys are just, you have no clue what you're speaking about, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's also a very weird sense of moral, this thing, that somehow it's not even a sustainability greenhouse, which anyway is bullshit, right? Now that we've seen, then the argument will be cruelty, right? A very carefully cherry picked definition of cruelty, right? Uh, Anyone who has to grow their own rice will stop eating rice. Have you any idea how notoriously human exploitative agriculture is? Rice is one of the worst. Sugarcane is one of the worst, right? There is no there is no rice agriculture without human suffering. So you have to be okay with that suffering,
Right.
right? And by the way, to grow an acre of rice, you have to ensure you kill millions of other beings, millions of other plants, millions of other living things to make sure that's the only species of living thing in that acre. That's how you get your food. Any agricultural field is a crime against nature. Nobody's saying that, because human beings are first moral that we got to eat. You can't starve, right? Letting people starve is a far greater crime than killing an animal, right? I think we can all agree on that, right? On the other hand, you kill one. If a farmer having some goats and chickens running around the house, right? Completely, by the way, that protein is free because the chickens will feed on agricultural waste and then produce more chickens. That is how animal husbandry was born. We domesticated animals that can turn agricultural waste into protein that you can consume. Of course, we've grown large and it's not sustainable because now everybody does not have goats and chickens running around. Now you have these giant cage farms where you cruelly treat chickens. Yes, terrible, absolutely terrible. And if there was an alternative available, we must go towards it. But I think, uh, you can't ask someone to change their eating habits and say on the basis of this nonsensical arguments about cruelty and so on, right? And I think, that's what I probably the only time where I said, what, I've largely been very, very sort of polite and positive on Instagram. But that one single time I was like, what, this is just
Lost
absolutely
it.
stupid.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons why people have this vegan friendly awareness more than the other way around is because of lack of documentaries. I mean, you have documentaries like Seaspiracy or Food Incorporated, which
Yes, yes.
largely talk about animal exploitation, but not so
Yeah,
much about
absolutely.
how bad
It's
agriculture is.
cherry picked, right? It's all cherry picked, right? I mean, I think in one general, I think people need to think that if your way of understanding the world is through Netflix documentaries, I'm sorry that you're going to get a very shallow understanding of the world, right?
Yeah,
Social media and Netflix and all the likes are not in the business of informing you. They're in the business of making entertaining content that goes viral. And sensationalism and negativity and cherry picking goes viral. And so actual knowledge is actually messy, complicated. You need to read,
several
and you
layers
need
to it.
to. There are several layers to it. You need to look at several aspects of the world, right? Here's the interesting thing, right? The carbon footprint of an carnivorous Indian meat eater is lower than an American vegan. Yeah, because the guy that American vegan is probably driving some SUV, or for that matter, a Tesla whose production is insanely carbon negative, right? All those rare earth metals and all of that. Okay, so it's said that people have no sense of proportion. And people really bad at numbers in general, right? And really bad at denominators. People casually forget denominators. Everyone looks at only the numerator, right? So that I think is a engineering way of looking at it, if you will. Yeah. So I
Mm.
think that's the whole thing. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, so thank you, Krish, so much for giving us time. I think it was a very, very entertaining episode. One of I think you will have to come back to the show once more to because
Sure.
time is just so less and we have so much to discuss. But I hope
Sure.
you had a good time talking about music and food.
It was great fun. Yeah, for a change, it was actually about music, and I'm sort of slightly bored talking about food now. So at least in the last 2 years.
Yeah, I can imagine. And that concludes my conversation with Krish Ashok. I even lost track of what all topics we covered during our call, but it's safe to say that we will definitely want him back on the show again. Well, I will be back with another guest. Till then, peace.